there's always a kind of range of diversity within a group, a species, and depending upon the environment, those members of that group who have certain characteristics can survive in that environment better than others. And those are the ones who will survive and who will pass those genes on. This is up against a kind of Lamarckian notion that you can acquire characteristics and that those could be passed on. You know, the sort of common example of it is the question about giraffes. You know, why giraffes have long necks. And a Lamarckian would say that giraffes have long necks because they exercise at stretching and straining for leaves in order to eat. We do know that in most cases, and there are certain exceptions when at a molecular level there's been some disruption from outside sources, but we do know for the most part that acquired characteristics, that is, that you build yourself up, you know, your muscles up or you stretch your neck or whatever it may be, that acquired characteristics are not heritable. But rather, from a Darwinian perspective, the reasons giraffes have long necks is that in a group of giraffes, those who had long necks were the ones who survived. Those with shorter necks did not survive. So that characteristic is passed on. What he does in this chapter, then, is to talk about that pre-scientific and scientific culture and this great gap between them. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, he suggests that in the pre-scientific culture, we were bound to our senses. We knew only reality that we could perceive with our unaided senses. And so we thought reality was what we could see. We thought visual reality was what we could actually see with our eyes. We thought oral reality was what we could actually hear with our ears. But we understand through the development of instrumental sciences that there's a whole reality that we just don't have access to because of the way our retinas are rigged. That we can't see certain kinds of light that insects can see. You know, that bees can see pollen radiating off of flowers. We simply cannot see it. We understand that there's an oral reality that we don't have access to. That bats, for instance, can send out these waves and have it return to them. They can hear the pulses on the air and know where there may be moths fluttering about. And moths themselves can hear this, which is why, you know, on summer evenings, you'll often see moths sort of whipping and swirling about, and part of it is this, you know, pursuit and evasion between bats and moths. So he asks this fundamental question. He says, if according to the traditional chain of being or hierarchy of being, which you'll see when we read Augustine is part of his worldview, that is the notion that we are, that at the top of this chain, this hierarchy, we have God, and then we have angels, and then we have humans, and then we have animal life, and plant life, and organic life. That's a particular worldview called a hierarchy of being. He asked the question from that perspective, why, if we're the summa bonum of creation, the highest good of creation, why is it that we don't have the physical capabilities to apprehend reality in the way that many other animals and insects do? And the answer to that, of course, comes to us from evolutionary science. That is, we have not needed it in order to survive. What you have are the characteristics that have enabled you to survive. And for instance, because moths are not a good source of nutrition, we never had to develop the kind of echolocation capabilities to find moths in order to consume them. So evolutionary theory reveals to us the extent that we have characteristics, that all animals, all species have characteristics that have enabled them to survive according to the environments that they reside. What he also does, and I think it's very important, he says later that he knows he sounds a little defensive about these things, and he says the reason he's a little defensive is because a lot of folks still will dismiss science and still dismiss evolutionary theory. He had mentioned earlier in chapter 3, one of the reasons for that, and he'll repeat this in chapter 11, is that science is bloodless, it's sterile, it's not comforting at all. He also suggests in chapter 11, we evolved to believe in religion, we didn't evolve to believe in science. That comes fairly recently. So he's a little defensive about it, and he wants to take on this question about theory. One of the reasons a lot of people will dismiss evolutionary theory is because it's just a theory, they will say, and so dismissible. What he works through on those pages is the definition of theory, what that really means in science. And it means something different in science than it means in just general culture, where anything goes in science. That there are certain criteria, and the primary one being that scientific theory, it has to undergo what he calls the acid wash of testing. And that true science is really interested in getting at the truth of the matter, almost in a Millian way. You know, Mill was less interested in just winning a point than he was in discovering truth, which is why he invited oppositional opinions. If he's wrong, he wants to know about it in order to correct where he was headed. There's no point in heading down a wrong path for simply political reasons. Well, the best of science, Wilson argues, works the same way. You want to know if you're on the wrong track. You want to know if you're making a mistake. And so this testing allows you to do that. And so when we talk about scientific theory, it's a much more rigorously tested theory than anything that we talk about in a kind of garden variety way. He will also suggest that there are certain criteria for science. And you recall, he suggests there has to be repeatability, that it has to be repeated in other laboratories, other kinds of settings. He suggests there has to be measurability, that you can measure and discover new things. In fact, what he calls heuristics. It should lead to other kinds of discoveries. There should be a kind of consilience. It should connect to our other knowledges. And so he'll say finally, you know, science and evolutionary theory, they all bear these marks. Other kinds of sciences, like creation science, ufology, and so on, these are not real sciences, they're pseudosciences, they're false sciences. They don't really correspond to any of these criteria that mark true science. He finishes this chapter by talking a little bit about the quest through logical positivism to find this point of inarguable reality. It fails ultimately, he says, for semantic reasons. We couldn't agree on what a fact was, and so on. And he says the real problem is we just didn't have enough understanding of the brain, that our neurophysiology, our understanding of it hadn't been developed enough. Okay, and then we move on to the next chapter, which is chapter 7, Genes to Culture. In Genes to Culture, he sets up another traditional dichotomy, and that is between the humanities and the science, between what we call nurture and nature. Usually when folks want to talk about why we are the way that we are, they may side on one way or another. They may incline to one side or another. That is, they might say, we are the way we are because of nurture, because of environment, that we are born into a particular state, and because we are influenced by those by family, by community, and so on, to such an extent that it makes us who we are, regardless of biology. Or the naturalists who would say we are who we are because of genetics, because of biology, and that really culture, environment has very little to do with it. Well, what he's going to argue is that that's a false dichotomy, that genes and culture are bound up with each other, and that those influences work reciprocally and progressively. And he'll talk about it in this way. He uses the example, and I think this is a good example, an interesting example. He'll talk about our fear of snakes, and how it comes from, our fear of snakes is underwritten by these epigenetic codes. So those are the mental biases of development, those hereditary biases of mental development that we have. And we have, most as human beings, in fact, most mammals, have, underwritten by those epigenetic rules, a fear of snakes. That doesn't mean, again, we're talking about groups. When we talk about evolution, we don't talk about individuals. We know that there are exceptions, right? We know some people who aren't really particularly afraid of snakes. The point is